Thanks everybody for dropping in. We do have a few more people we're expecting, and I'm sure we'll get started right away here. And I'm going to pass it off to Samir right away. Thank you for hosting us. We are happy to have everyone today and talk about some immigration strategies to keep you either in the US or the possibility of staying in Canada or going between Canada and the US.
So this is covering what we're going to learn today. We'll start off with some intros for Samir, Daniel, and me. Then Daniel's going to cover how Canadian immigration works, work visas, permanent residence, citizenship. Daniel will go through all of those. Then I'm going to cover, if you're a tech worker, here's 2 ways you could utilize those immigration programs to move to Canada. And then Samir is going to come in on the long-term strategy of the what ifs. What are the Boomerang strategies to come back to the US? He's got a bunch of them mapped out. We'll talk through all of those, basically giving you choices, looking down the road of like, what are the best options for you and your family? Then we'll end it with a Q&A. We'll try and go fast through the presentation. We already have dozens of questions people have sent in. All of them are great. We'll try and cover as many as we can. Let's jump to the next slide, please. And this will be introduction to Samir. Over to you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, you're catching me fresh off a COVID diagnosis. So the last few days have been pretty brutal, but starting to back on my feet again. I'll make sure to mute myself when I cough. I'm still here in isolation, but happy to kind of participate and present here. My name is Samir. I own a law firm called Banyan out of Silicon Valley in California. We do almost exclusively business immigration for technology talent. And we're super excited to be here and share whatever kind of information can be helpful.
Thanks, Samir. Yeah. I think next up is going to be Daniel, and you're on mute.
Thanks, Mark. Samir, Marc, thanks for having me today to join the two of you to discuss this exciting topic. To give everyone a brief introduction, I'm an immigration lawyer based in Toronto, Canada. We help clients around the world with obtaining temporary work permits and permanent residency for Canada, whether it's someone coming as an individual, professional, as an entrepreneur, as an investor, or they're coming to work in Canada pursuant to a job offer with a company. We're the firm that can help you with that. We do a lot of cross-border work, assisting a lot of persons who are in the United States, whether they be American citizens or temporary workers in the US, and have partnered with Marc and Syndesis for a number of years to help people come to Canada for that purpose. And happy to help you today and answer any questions that anyone might have at the end of this seminar.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. And then quick intro of me. I used to be based in Silicon Valley too, where Samir is. Now I'm over in New York, but 20 plus years working for VC-backed tech companies. The Canada angle is personal for me because I live in Canada for 5 years, 2 years on a student visa. I did my MBA in Canada, came right back to Silicon Valley to work at a startup, and then ended up living in Toronto for a few years on work visas, working in venture capital and tech, then came back home to Silicon Valley. And then a few years later, I'm like, I think this is my first company. I can figure out a way to bridge the gap between solutions on both sides of the border. So we have 2 solutions we'll talk through. It's if someone's on OPT and cannot stay in the US, we have a way to sponsor a Canadian work visa. Syndesis is a Canadian corporation. And then we also built a marketplace called Path to Canada. I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. But basically, we have some ways to help people get to Canada permanently. And then we'll talk long range about what options work best for you. And for the next slide, Daniel, over to you to talk about Canadian immigration options.
Thanks, Marc. So I get this question asked a lot by tech workers, and it's how do I work in Canada? How do I get a work visa for Canada? And Canada is very unique, very different than the United States in that we've established an entire system basically for tech workers to come and work in Canada. And the first part of that is getting a temporary work permit through something called the Global Talent Stream. And so if you have a job offer in a tech occupation or a what do they call, like a business savvy occupation, you can come to Canada and get a work permit, provided that the employer is offering you a wage that is consistent with what a Canadian would earn for that job. Now, there are a number of occupations that fall on that list that are eligible for the program. Alice, if you want to flip to the next slide and show the audience here those occupations, you can see it's very, very broad and covers a lot. So it's not just your software engineers, software developers who are on there, but it's also people who are coming in as data scientists, statisticians and mathematicians, business and systems analysts, security systems analysts, and a whole host of them that we've just tried to summarize a few of them on this sheet. But if you do have a job offer, it's for a full-time position in one of these occupations with a Canadian employer, you can get a work permit, which then leads to the question, well, why would I do that? How often can I apply? When is this thing open? If you flip over to the next slide, Allison, I can walk as well the audience through how this system works and why it's so different than the H-1B system that they may be familiar with. So the first part of that is there are no caps on the number of workers that can obtain a Canadian temporary work visa through the global talent stream. There's also no lottery, which means you can apply at any time so long as the employer qualifies, the position qualifies, and you qualify for that position. It's open 365 days a year, so literally 24 hours a day. You can apply online for this global talent stream work permit. When you do become a worker, you are issued an employer specific work permit, and you can, on that work permit, later apply for permanent residency. I can explain how that works in a few moments. But when you go from employer to employer, like you are in the United States, may be familiar with the portability of H-1B visas. We don't have that in Canada. So you have to have this arranged employment with one employer. So long as you have arranged employment in Canada, when you're applying for permanent residency on a work permit, you can obtain benefit of that through our permanent residency system. What also makes this system very unique from the United States is that there's no cap by country of origin. I know that for, as we talk about the next slide, permanent residency, and as Samir may talk about, there are caps in the United States based on a person's country of origin as a percentage of the total number of permanent admissions that can be admitted through an employment-based permanent residency application. We don't have that in Canada. Canada is open to as many people from as many countries to come in to apply under our global talent stream and then subsequently to apply for permanent residency. So Allison, if you don't mind switching over to the next slide, please. So how does this all work? Person who wants to come, they get a job offer and they come in under the global talent stream. What then? So the global talent stream process is pretty fast. You start with an initial position or in company approval. Pre-COVID, take about 2 to 3 weeks to get that approval in. And then you'd apply online for a work permit. And again, it would take about 2 weeks. Things are a little bit backlogged, a little bit delayed. We're seeing a total processing times stretching to the 10, sometimes 12-week mark as the immigration department is trying to rein in its previous backlog. Once you have your work permit, you arrive in Canada and you're interested in applying for permanent residency. So yeah, you come to Canada, you got your work permit, you're here. It took you maybe a few weeks to get that permit. And now you're interested in applying for permanent residency. So a person can apply for permanent residency through Canada's express entry system. The government has a processing target to complete an application for permanent residency under express entry in 6 months or less. The catch to that is you cannot apply under the express entry system unless you've first been invited. And it's a competition. So the way that a person would obtain an invitation to apply under express entry, it's kind of like applying to a job offer, if I could use an analogy, borrow from that common world scenario. Let's suppose you are interested in applying for a job, so you see a posting for that job on the internet, and you decide to submit an application for that job. You submit your resume to the employer. Now put yourself in the employer's shoes. They've got a job posting online. It has certain criteria. Perhaps you need to have a couple years of work experience, a degree, strong communication skills, and you receive resumes from all of these candidates. And from that pool of candidates, you quickly go through them and to determine who submitted a resume here meets the minimum criteria that I posted in my job posting. And the hiring manager filters out those who don't meet the minimum criteria. Okay. In the context of applying for permanent immigration to Canada under the express entry system, there's a similar filtering process. You submit your profile, it's kind of like a resume, and if you meet the minimum criteria of the program, you'll be filtered in as a candidate. If you don't meet the minimum criteria, your candidacy will be immediately rejected. Kind of like that hiring manager going through the resumes quickly and saying, oh, that person has a degree, that one doesn't have a degree. That person's in, that person's out, for example. And then what's the next step that you may be familiar with when you're applying for a job? It's the interview stage, right? Before you can get a job, someone's going to want to speak to you about your credentials. They want to speak to you about your work experience. They want to make sure that you know what it is that you are doing so that way you can do the job. So immigration to Canada is actually working in the same way. Somebody has to contact you to invite you to quote unquote interview for Canadian immigration. But the interview process for Canadian immigration isn't a one-on-one with an officer. Instead, the immigration department will send an invitation to you to submit a full application with paperwork to support all the statements that you made in your profile. Now, they don't just invite everyone who has cleared the minimum criteria hurdle to be considered a candidate. They only invite the highest ranked candidate. It's kind of like that hiring manager who's got 100 resumes in front of her. And she says, okay, well, I don't have time to interview 100 people. So instead of interviewing 100 people, I'm going to go through these resumes quickly. I'm going to pick the best 5 candidates that I can find out of this resume pile here. And I'm only going to invite those 5 people to a job interview. The immigration department for Canada is doing exactly the same thing on a much bigger scale. They're looking at all the resumes or all the profiles that are being submitted by persons who are interested in becoming permanent residents and meet the minimum criteria of the programs. But they're only going to invite the highest ranked candidates. The government conducts these rounds of invitations or draws every 2 weeks. You can submit a profile at any time, and that profile is valid for 1 year. So you may or may not get picked the first time the government does a draw. And if you're not picked that first time, you would stay a candidate in the pool and you'd wait it out a little bit longer. If your score, however, is not competitive against the other candidates, you'll never get picked. If it is competitive, being that you are a higher ranked candidate than your peers, you will get picked. But of course, it changes every 2 weeks. Every time the government draws candidates, what we consider to be a competitive candidate will fluctuate depending on the number of people that the government invites, right? And also the frequency. Sometimes it's every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's every 3 weeks. The government doesn't tell us exactly in advance how many people they're going to invite, but there are some trends that we can follow. But if you are invited and you submit an application, you should expect that application to get processed in about 6 months. And from there, you can then apply after becoming a permanent resident for citizenship. So how does that work? Well, you become eligible usually within 3 years of arriving. And I say usually because it depends on how much time you're spending in Canada. If you're in Canada full time, living in Canada, you have to acquire 3 years of physical presence in Canada in the 5-year period before applying for citizenship. Now, that 3 years that you spend in Canada has to be as a permanent resident. If you initially came as a temporary resident, you will get partial credit for that time spent in Canada, up to 50%. You have 50% credit, up to a maximum of 1 year. So if you were in Canada for 1 year as a temporary resident, you came initially under Global Talent Stream Work Permit, you started working in Canada. After a few months, you got your application together and you submitted it. It took another 6 months to process. You were here for 1 year before you became a PR. You'll get 6 months of credit, stay another 2.5 years, and you will then be eligible to apply for Canadian citizenship. That process right now is taking about a year to process a citizenship application. I should actually say that normally it takes about a year. During COVID, with all our backlogs and everything, it's actually taking a couple of years now to process those applications. But generally speaking, you should expect as we return to normal processing about 1 year, and then you'll be able to apply for a Canadian passport. Now, throughout the COVID pandemic, the express entry system was substantially paused. And we had a number of people inquiring me and Marc about what's provincial nomination, does Syndisa support provincial nomination, does your law firm support provincial nomination? And I wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing what provincial nomination is. So Allison, if you can flip to the next slide, appreciate it. So Canada has a federal immigration system that I've discussed so far. And it allows you to move to any province, any territory, any place in Canada, except for the province of Quebec. We don't have to get into that right now. Quebec has a separate immigration selection system, but Canada has a total of 13 provinces and territories. Each of them have the ability to design their own immigration selection programs, and they've done that. So how does all that work? Well, provincial nomination is just another pathway for someone to obtain Canadian permanent residency, right? We first look at the federal pathway, and if that's not working out for a client, we'll take a look at the provincial pathways. The point, though, of a provincial nomination is that you actually have to intend to reside in the province that is nominating you. So if you were to, say, have a desire to move to British Columbia, we find Vancouver, Victoria, and other beautiful cities in Canada, and other beautiful places in Canada. And that's where you wanted to move. But you were really working in Nova Scotia, right? Well, you couldn't, and you wanted to continue to live in Nova Scotia, right? Well, you couldn't apply to BC's provincial nomination program unless you intended to move to British Columbia. You have to move there. Similarly, you couldn't apply to Saskatchewan's nomination program if you're in Ontario, or you have a desire to move to Ontario. You actually have to move to the place that is nominating you, and you have to have a genuine intention to move there. We have provincial nomination programs, streams, and systems. And without getting too technical, programs are the general criteria for establishing eligibility for nomination by a province. Okay, streams are subcategories of these programs. So you'll have an overarching program, for example, for skilled workers, for college or university graduates, or for entrepreneurs and investors. And then they'll have different streams or subcategories, right? So there'll be a category for skilled workers, for example, who appear on an occupation list. There'll be a category for skilled workers who have a job offer, or there'll be, an open category. If you have any sort of skilled work and work experience, you can apply. And then we have these systems where it's either open or closed. And what that means is an open system is anybody can apply for this at any time on a first come, first served basis. Usually it's controlled by a cap or a quota. If Allison, you want to switch to the next slide. There you go. Yeah. And then we have an open system where anyone can apply, and then you have a closed competitive system, which is that you have to first express an interest, and the province has to indicate that they are interested and invite you to apply. It's kind of like the federal immigration system. You can't apply to a province in the closed system unless they first invite you. All right. So there's a couple of different streams that people often ask about. The Ontario government has a program called the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, something called the Human Capital Priority Stream, and something even more specific to this group, which is called the Tech Draw. All right. It's for persons who have 1 or more year of recent full-time experience paid in a tech occupation. They possess a university degree and they have strong English language ability. So if you wanted to apply to this, you have to take an English language test. You have to have your foreign education credentials assessed for the Canadian work experience. And then you submit a federal express entry profile, and you select Ontario as the province that you're interested in. And then you just wait for Ontario to reach out to you. All right, so that would be an example of a system it's closed. Okay, it's a competition. You can't apply unless the government has invited you. But if they do invite you, you submit your application to Ontario for nomination. They will assess it and forward you a nomination certificate if you are in fact eligible for the program. At which point you turn to the government of Canada with that nomination certificate and say, here you go. I'm applying for permanent residency now as a nominee of the province of Ontario. Now, British Columbia also has a skilled worker tech stream, but in this particular situation, the difference between it and the Ontario stream is you need a job offer from a BC employer. All right. Now, these are not the only two ways of applying. There are combinations of open and closed systems, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to highlight how they work. Some of them are connected to Express Entry, like the Ontario stream. Some of them are not. Some of them give you the option to connect it or not connect it to Express Entry. So lots of different combinations. But we always start with the federal Express Entry system when a person is interested in applying for permanent residency. The advantage of having a job offer with an employer like Syndesis, and Marc's going to talk about how that works in a moment, but it gives you the ability to apply, for example, for an Ontario nomination program called the Foreign Skilled Worker Stream. And that would be only open to people who have a job offer from an eligible employer in Ontario. So that's one advantage. But it also gives you another advantage on the Express Entry system. So if you're coming to Canada, you got this global talent stream work permit, you're here and you're ready to work. Well, guess what? You'll get additional points for having arranged employment on Express Entry, making you more competitive. Right? So I believe that's all I have to say about the global talent stream, Express Entry, and provincial nomination. I think, Marc, if you wanted to talk about how people can actually come to Canada to make that happen, people see a little bit more clearly how working with Syndesis can translate that. How working with Syndesis can be translated into a work permit or permanent residency for Canada.
Thanks, Daniel. And Daniel, what you've shared, the different Canadian immigration options, oftentimes, from my experience, and I'll talk about someone trying to get to Canada, will say, well, Marc, I did my research on Express Entry and I'm in the pool and I'm waiting. And what I always say is, like, that's one way in. Always highly suggest you work with a Canadian immigration lawyer like Daniel that can point you in all the different directions. The other side is, I guess I would call them more like, the two we're going to talk about are faster because they both use global talent stream. So the two options I'm going to talk about are basically saying, yeah, you could be waiting in that pool, waiting for a draw. But if you have the opportunity to use a work visa, you don't wait for what happens with global. You don't wait. You have to wait what happens with Express Entry. Your work visa gets approved. You go to Canada immediately and start doing that job. And as Daniel says, you get there and then you're like, year one in Canada, more points. Have a Canadian job offer, working in Canada. Daniel, I think it's 50 points for that. They start adding up once you're inside Canada. So think of, like, we all know people you've heard of people going through Express Entry. It's just one way in. I'm going to talk about the ways where they're faster because they're more job driven. Two options we'll walk through is, for a small percentage of you, I say 1 or 2% on this call or in general, there's a way to get to Canada where you're like, you've got a US job, it's working out well, you like it. The challenge is you didn't get picked in the lottery. 3 tries, you're still on OPT. Third try, you did not get picked this year. And now you know you have to leave the US by a certain date. That's the option we're going to talk about first. Second option we're going to talk about is completely different. It's if you took matters in your own hands and say, I just want to move to Canada. I want a Canadian company who will sponsor me. My US company is not going to move me. I work for a big tech company. I work for one of the big consulting houses. They're not willing to help me. The second opportunity we're going to talk through is where you're in control. So Alison, we'll jump to the next slide, please. So the first option is moving your job. I think the best way to give an example of it is to talk how it worked out for Pranav. So probably a few months after COVID hit, his employer reached out and said, we read about that Syndesis can do this. You can sponsor Canadian work permits. Here's Pranav's situation, expiring OPT at the end of the year. There's no more tries. He's going to leave. He is very important to our firm. We want to continue employing him, but it will be very challenging if he goes home to India with time zone considerations, et cetera. And then Pranav was on the call and he says, yeah, I think my American dream's over. I can't stay. And then I heard this option for Canada. How does this work? So this is how this scenario often works. We have the workers describing their situation. We have the company, his company is out of Dallas. And they're like, what can you do here? What's the option? So basically what we were able to do with Pranav is he had a tech job. We sponsored a Canadian work visa. It was approved. This is all like in the middle of COVID, when the border actually stayed open. The Canadian border was open. Permanent residents can't move to Canada. Students, you still could. Work visas, you had to quarantine, you had to go through a bunch of stuff, test negative, but you actually could come in. So what Syndesis did is we sponsored his work visa. Took a little longer than usual. Daniel worked on this file. It was done later in the year, and Pranav was able to move to Vancouver, moved up there, basically takes his laptop with him, missed maybe, he did it over the holidays. So picture the first year of COVID when no one was traveling much. Pranav and his wife moved from Dallas to Vancouver, took his laptop with him. In the new year when he started, this was beginning of last year, he is now in Canada with a Canadian work visa. Syndesis is able to sponsor that. So his work visa has Syndesis on it. And he basically continued his exact same job on Zoom, working for his employer in Dallas, working remotely. Now he's going through the permanent residence process. Anytime he should get his Canadian permanent residence. Once he receives it, he has an option. He can say, great, I enjoyed working for this US company remotely. Syndesis, thanks for sponsoring it. I think I want to go work for any Canadian company that calls me. Maybe my dream is to go work for Amazon Canada. Doors wide open. Once he has his PR, I think it'll happen in less than 2 years. He can work for any Canadian company. And by the way, his partner, I think, had challenges in the US working on an H4. Every Canadian work visa, when you get it, it automatically comes with an open work visa for your partner. They can work for any Canadian company. US people have told us we run into strict restrictions around H4. Do you qualify? What's the situation? Canada's like, no restriction. If one person has a work visa that's tied to the company that came in, the other person should have a open work visa and work for anyone. That's just a quick overview of how it actually worked for someone. We'll jump to the next slide and I'll walk through a little bit details on how this happens. Well, Allison, please jump to there we go. Thanks. So how to move your job offer? Some people, usually the employer's like, how? Like, how could this work? And so we tell them, we're an employer of record in Canada. We are a Canadian corporation. Canadian corporations have the right to use Canadian immigration. We have permission from the Canadian government to bring dozens and dozens of workers in. Therefore, if someone qualifies, as Daniel says, tech worker, are they coding? Do they fit in any of their descriptions? Are they the manager of someone, data scientist? Canada makes it very easy to qualify. It's your tech background, either have a tech degree or you have enough years work experience to make you qualify. You have a Canadian company sponsoring your work visa, Syndesis, salary of, I think it's about 90,000 or more. And all those things are in place. Qualify for the work visa. Takes about, as Daniel said, takes about 90 days start to finish. And in this model, you basically take your US job and you move up. That second bullet sounds great in terms of it says like same job, same title. That's basically when you have a friendly US company that you work with. That's why I said only 1 or 2% of you, where the US company doesn't have a Canadian office, doesn't have a Canadian branch, does not have any operations in Canada. So it's usually a smaller or mid-sized business. A lot of our clients who do this are VC backed. They have the funds in the US and they say this worker is an integral part of our company. We do not want to lose them when they go back to home country. We like the idea of moving them from San Francisco to Vancouver, New York, Dallas to Toronto, or anywhere in Canada. Similar time zone that can continue working for the team is an easy transition. But in this model, your employer has to be part of the decision. It's both of you saying yes to this because there are no fees for the worker, but your US employer, they will be paying fees for immigration law help, for our fee to do this. And then ongoing from that point, once they get to Canada, Syndesis basically says, hey, we'll employ you. We are employer of record. We have that service. Therefore, the US company is confused about operating in Canada. We're like, don't worry about it. For a monthly fee, we employ the worker in Canada. We handle Canadian payroll, Canadian healthcare, Canadian HR, Canadian 401k, all that stuff in the US. We tell the American company, we're going to mimic everything you had in the US. The worker just starts in Canada. All the stuff basically carries over. We'll handle all that Canadian stuff. US company doesn't have to worry. I think Pranav's company was like less than 50 people. They were a small company. For them, this was easy. They're like, good, someone to handle the Canadian work, the Canadian details in the background and help us with immigration. We can jump to the next slide, please, Allison. So qualify, as I mentioned, it's remote. Sometimes people come at us and say, hey, can I move across the border and then fly back and fly around the US and work with clients? No, this is, you're going to Canada. It is a permanently remote job. It is not work for consultants or people who travel heavily. You come back to the border, the US immigration is going to be like, oh, I see you on OPT status and expired. You cannot come back to the US and work. This is more of your remote permanent in Canada. And as I said earlier, your company signing the agreements, there's no fees to you, but it's an agreement with your US company to do this. And you basically have to give up on your American dream, but not entirely. A couple slides in, we're going to talk about how we could do this as a short-term measure. The other option, you work for a company that says, I'm sorry, we can't help you with this. We're not going to be able to do this. This is 98% of you on this call are probably a situation where you're like, yeah, my employer wouldn't do that. They're not going to, I'd asked them and they were not willing to move my job. Now we're going to help you. The other option is, let's get you a Canadian job. Let's give you control of your destiny. So we'll jump over to the next slide, please, Allison. Give you the example of Chaitanya. So Chaitanya in the US won the H-1B lottery. He has an H-1B, had an awesome US job. Tech career is going fine, has the H-1B. His US lawyer said, immigration lawyer said, okay, good news, bad news. You have an H-1B, you're fine. Your job is great, you're happy there. All good news. For permanent residents, you have a long wait. It's more than 10 years. You are in the backlog. I'm sorry, I have no good news for you. So Chaitanya heard that and he's like, I thought I did everything right. I went to good US school. I worked hard. I got a job. I got the H-1B. And now I can't get a green card because that's how US immigration works. And as he said to us, he used the words depressed, disillusioned. He's like, how can I bring my family over from India? How can I buy a house? How can I plan when I'm on this work visa and I don't see a future of getting a green card? I'm not on a fast track. I've got a ways to go. So Chaitanya had heard on a webinar, similar conversation. Daniel might have been working with me on this webinar. He heard there was an option for Path to Canada. So he went to the Path to Canada website, filled out the Am I a Candidate form. Our recruiting team called him up. He went through a couple rounds of vetting. And he's like, well, maybe they'll call me up someday and find me an opportunity. Right after that, we did. So we found an opportunity, he interviewed, got the job. And then 90 days later, was in Canada. And he arrived in January this year. I had dinner with him in February. Just wanted to see how it went. I want to understand his story. He's like, yeah, Mark. He's like, I watched you on an interview talking about this. I filled a form out, and then your recruiting team is like, they're putting opportunities in front of me. I interview, I get hired, and then you said it takes a few months. COVID slowed the processing down, and then this work visa shows up, and then I moved to Canada. He's like, before I move, you guys have a webinar. You showed me how to get a Canadian Social Security number. You showed me how to get how to do banking in Canada, healthcare in Canada, how to move up there, the whole process. You guys connected me with a real estate agent. I talked to them. He's like, you had the whole steps, all, for what it's like for someone who's never lived in Canada to move there. And he's like, I kept waiting for you guys to reach out and charge me. And I'm like, Chaitanya, we don't charge candidates. He's like, I believe you now. He's like, but that's not standard. I'm used to people trying to charge. If you want to, we always know there's immigration professionals that charge you to move up, move people around the world. And I'm like, we charge the US company, we charge the Canadian company in this situation. We'll never charge a candidate. So that's just a quick overview of who fits in our pool for Path to Canada. It's the people who often have a work permit. They've got their H-1B and they're like, but I can't get a green card and I don't want to wait forever. As Daniel said, work visas come fast. By the end of your 2 years, you're probably a permanent resident. Then you're gunning for immigration, fast track in Canada. You can line all that up and get that. What does Path to Canada do? We're basically we're a marketplace. We are connecting immigration professionals, most in the US, but from anywhere in the world, doesn't matter. We just moved someone from the Philippines to Toronto. Anywhere you are, India, Pakistan, Spain, Singapore, South America, it doesn't matter. If you've either been in the US, you have US work experience, you had to leave the US, you're in the US now, you have bad news from your immigration lawyer. Our goal is to help you move to Canada. We're going to connect you with Canadian tech companies. In this case, they sponsor your work visa. It's not Syndesis, it's the Canadian company saying, I'm using Global Talent Stream. I want to bring in the best people from around the world. here's a pool of vetted people for path to Canada. This is a great opportunity for us to access people we could never access in Canada. So our pool is, our goal here is to help grow the Canadian tech ecosystem by bringing people in. Let's jump to the next slide. This is quickly how it works. You fill out an application, pass 2 video interviews with the Path to Canada team. You get interviewed, company decides to hire you. They make you a verbal offer. You have the right to refuse it. If you're like, hey, this is great, you bargain with them, you come to an agreement on your salary. 8 to 10 weeks, could be 12 weeks to get you all the way through LMI and work permit. Step 6, work permit comes. You send your passport for stamping. You're into Canada shortly thereafter. While you've been waiting, we've walked you through a global mobility process of how to move to Canada and how to get set up. You're ready to start your new Canadian life. We'll jump to the last slide before we jump over to Samir. So this is the twist of this presentation. Normally when Daniel and I are doing this presentation, it's like, let's get you to Canada. But over the years, we've talked to people who said, Canada sounds good, but what if? What if down the road, I got to Canada, I worked there for a couple of years, I get my permanent residence, I get my citizenship. Is there a strategy for me to come back to the US? I'm playing the long game. What about if I want options? So in this case, you work 2 years in Canada, you get your permanent residence between year 1 and 2, you're holding that in your hand, you're like, you go back to Daniel, the immigration professional, and you're like, okay, help me with permanent residence. Help me get into the as fast as you can, help me get citizenship. 4 to 5 years, you're a Canadian citizen. And now you have options. So now we're going to jump back to Samir on the next slide. You've made it all the way in. What's possible? Samir, over to you. Basically the first option is for the person who says, I'm staying, I'm done. Canadian option works, but now you're going to suggest other places where you can help people going forward.
Well, Mark, after hearing you and kind of Daniel just so clearly explain the process, I would say Canada sounds real good right now. all of us here in the US are super jealous of how simple and kind of commonsensical the Canadian immigration process is. And as everyone here knows, the US process is far from that. So many of our clients, we are working with Mark and sending them to Mark if they're super frustrated with how long things are taking here. But as Mark, or the inability to get an H-1B like Pranav, right? But as Mark explained, many of you may eventually want to come back. And so that's what I kind of hope to explain. That's always a possibility, right? And might be even easier after you kind of complete this Canadian immigration process. The first step, we'll just talk about the most straightforward one, the TN visa. And this is in the case of you've obtained your work visa, you've gotten PR in Canada, and you've applied for citizenship and you received Canadian citizenship, right? So you're not a PR now, you're a Canadian citizen. You are now eligible to come to the US, sponsored by an American employer for a TN visa, which is, for all intents and purposes in the technology world, very similar to the H-1B. You need to, basically be a software engineer or software engineer adjacent, right? In order to get a TN visa. There's no minimum wage requirement really. Super flexible on location. Not as flexible on like whether you have the intent to get a green card or not, but it's generally not so much of an issue because you still get these visas in 3-year increments. So they're a pretty good deal. You apply at the airport in Canada, or we can, apply for you here at a service center in the US. But, theoretically speaking, you can get the visa just before your flight into the US. So there are all these things that Canadians, all these privileges that Canadians enjoy that many non-Canadians, it kind of blows their mind, right? They don't realize that these things exist that Canadians have been using for many, many years, the TN visa being the prime example. The other kind of benefit to becoming a Canadian citizen, by the way, is if you want another visa, let's say the H-1B, you don't have to visa stamp anymore because Canadians don't need visa stamps. So they're the only nationality in the world that don't have to go to a consulate and get a visa stamp to come to the US. So for all of us or all of you who have had to get visa stamps at a consulate abroad and know how painful that process is, that sounds amazing. And let's talk about the H-1B. So maybe not Pranav's case because he wasn't able to get one, but in Chanaya's case, has an H-1B, the green card process, as we'll talk about in a second, taken way too long, right? If he's already been picked in the lottery, but decided to go to Canada, now wants to come back to the US can still do so with the H-1B because he's already been picked in the lottery. Now, he may only be due the amount of years that are left, the difference between the maximum of 6 and whatever he's used up until the point that he left. He can even use it for intermittent employment in the US. So let's say he wants to remain in Canada for a while, but his employer is cool enough and flexible enough to allow him to come to the US, let's say once every couple months, or 1 month for every 3 months, or whatever it is. You need a work visa to come into the US for that duration, right? You can use the H-1B. So I have a couple of clients that are doing that right now, using the H-1B while they're waiting for their Canadian citizenship to clear. And I'll talk about the other thing that we're doing for one of those clients right now, which is the EB-1. But the O-1 visa, last option, extraordinary ability visa, it's a good dovetail into the EB-1. That's also something you can use. I mean, consider now you've been working for 3, 4, 5, 6 years in Canada, building up quite the profile for yourself, right? You're not the same person that you were when you left the US to go to Canada. You might have put yourself in a position to qualify for the O-1. And that's a longer discussion. But essentially, you just have to show that you're one of the top few percent of what you do in the field. Very common ways to do that would be to show that you play kind of a critical or leading role for your company that's a well-known company, kind of within its own right, within its own field or subfield. Maybe you've made some unique contributions to your entire field in general. Maybe you've won some awards, maybe you've published, maybe you've judged competitions. These are all different. Maybe you've have a higher than normal salary. These are all different examples of how you can qualify for the O-1. I'm going to put myself on mute for 1 second. I promised you I was going to get a cough in there. A little hard to talk after that COVID bout. So, but that's, once again, that's a good dovetail into the EB-1, okay? What is the EB-1? The EB-1 is, or the EB-1A, to be more specific, is a way to sponsor yourself for a US green card, US permanent residency, okay? Whereas normally, as you know, most of the time employers have to sponsor you. So you're under their control, but with the EB-1A is a way to kind of not be under their control. You can be under your own control and you can kind of chart your own path, right? The criteria are very similar to the O-1 visa, slightly harder because the stakes are higher. And there is kind of an additional layer of scrutiny the government can impose on you with the EB-1A based on a case that all of us, immigration lawyers hate, that we're not going to talk about right now. So, but the point being, this is not something that you should kind of look at when I'm looking to go back to the US after I spent several years in Canada, because this is something that almost without fail, people that I talk to wish they had started preparing themselves earlier to qualify for this, because they just didn't know. They thought this was something that was for PhDs and scientists and researchers and Einsteins and Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, right? And that's not true. Once again, if you can show that you meet the minimum, at least 3, we prefer 4 of the criteria. If you can do that, then you're an EB-1. And there are ways to do that with kind of deliberate intent and effort, right? Guided by somebody who obviously knows, what you should be doing, right? And in almost all cases, the steps that you take to build an EB-1 profile for yourself are almost undoubtedly going to help you in your career anyways, right? Or you can even just kind of pick and choose. I'm going to work on these 3 or 4 criteria because this is what makes the most sense for my career, right? So it's not without effort. It's not difficult. It's not difficult. It is difficult. It is a bit of a rocky road, but it's much better than the alternative, which is, Marc mentioned a 10-year wait. That's what the government wants you to think. But really, studies have shown that the wait is upwards of 50 to 70 years, currently unworkable. Hopefully it's going to change. But with the only way it's going to change is with the deadlock in Congress being solved somehow. And that doesn't have a great track record right now. So take matters into your own hands. Look at the EB-1 and think of it as something that you need to plan for in the future and start working on, maybe while you're going into Canada. So go into Canada, do amazing in your job, but do it in a way that it also helps your EB-1. And what that does is it allows you to use the EB-1 as a vehicle to gain permanent residence in the US after you finish your stint in Canada. So, and after you get a US green card, what happens to your Canadian citizenship? Excuse me, 1 second. Daniel, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you keep it, right? I mean, once you have citizenship, there's no more residency obligations in Canada. Now you have the residency obligations in the US, right? So you want to make sure that once you have the green card, that you're planning your presence in the US and your jobs and all the ties you have to maintain to help kind of keep those ties intact and keep your permanent residency intact. Once you get your US citizenship, you can also keep your Canadian citizenship. You can hold them both at the same time. So with that, I'll hand it back to Marc to transition us off to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Thanks, Daniel. I know you have to leave in 9 minutes, so I think Allison, if you can find some of the questions that maybe focus. I know we had like dozens of them come in before the event, and some have been coming in during. So maybe if you could run through some of the questions that are maybe more U.S. immigration focused while we have Samir, we'll try and cover some of those first.
No problem. Let me just grab them. I'm going to open up my sheet here. I have everybody's written down. Okay. So I'm just going to read them out, and apologies. I'm going to do my best to pronounce everybody's name. So Sanyam asks, I would like to know more about my eligibility for EB-1 as well, so that I can work towards it and better my profile.
So for that's a common question I'm getting right now. Just please send me a direct message. Look me up on LinkedIn, and I'll send you information on how we can get that done for you.
Awesome. And then let me see here. Esther was also wondering, do we have any information on R1 visas?
Oh, you're muted, Samir.
You're muted,
R1,
Samir.
I didn't.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. Did you say R1?
R-1, yes.
R-1. We don't do a lot of those. Those are religious worker visas. It's not necessarily, we don't do like a high number of those. I've done them in the past. But if you contact me offline, I can get you some more information on that.
No worries. I'm going to keep going through them, and feel free to jump in the chat if anybody has any additional questions.
I think number 5 would be really from Mish Felix.
Yeah, that was actually the next one. Thanks, Daniel. So Mish Felix asks, relocating to Canada without losing priority date, what to consider?
Yeah, great question. So not much, honestly. Once you have your priority date, it's yours, even if you're outside the country. I mean, the way the green card situation, the green card system in our US, in the US was constructed, it was to allow companies to sponsor foreign nationals who are living outside the US, because that's how it was in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s when our current system was created, and it has not been changed since, right? So it doesn't reflect kind of the current state of affairs in the internet and technology age. So once you have your priority date, so long as your employer has not revoked your I-140 petition within 6 months of its approval, it's yours, right? So if you go to Canada and want to come back like on an EB-1A, or maybe even come back as an EB-1C multinational manager, or just even a simple EB-2, you can still retain your priority date.
Awesome. All right. Goval asks, is it possible to live in Canada on a PR and commute to the US for work via a land border while on an H-1B?
So Daniel, I'll answer the US immigration part, but I think there's probably a part that you want to talk about maintaining residence in Canada. And sorry if there isn't anything to say about that, but yeah, I do have clients that are doing that. They are coming via land border. What do you have to have? You have to have valid work authorization and permission to enter the US, right? Whenever you do. So whether that's the H-1B, you can't have a TN yet because you're not a Canadian citizen, most likely going to be an H-1B. So if you have the H-1B and your employer is cool with it, meaning it's not the most ideal arrangement for the employer. It's not illegal, but it's definitely a headache from a payroll perspective. But if they're cool with it, then you can enter via land border with intermittent entries on your work visa, most likely the H-1B.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, you can continue to maintain your residency obligation in Canada by commuting back and forth. It's counted as the number of days you spent in Canada. The way that day is interpreted, it's literally any moment on a particular day. So I have clients who have like what we would consider a 9-day week. They'll be in Canada, they'll be living in Canada, they'll be commuting to the United States, they'll be counting up their number of days in Canada, counting up their number of days in the United States. And so even people who are not commuting on a daily basis, maybe to the US and then back, once a week there, once a week back, they're spending a weekend here in Canada. And if you start counting up the number of days, okay, so they re-entered on Friday. They stayed for, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, they drive to the United States. That's 4 days in Canada. But then they're in the United States, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We have a 9-day week here from an immigration perspective. But that's perfectly fine. They've maintained their residency obligation by spending 730 days in every 5-day period, or about 40% of their time. When it comes to citizenship, they have to spend 3 years of their 5-year period in Canada. So it's 3 years of physical presence here. But there's also a tax component to that. They have to be filing their taxes as a tax resident of Canada for 3 years. And so that's where things can get a little bit complicated. You're actually in the United States working there on H-1B. You're probably receiving, and Samir, you can talk maybe a little bit about this, but probably getting a pay slip, US W-2 at the end of the year. But then you're living in Canada. Right? So the question is, how do I file my taxes as a tax resident of Canada? What are the tax implications? That's really outside the scope of immigration, and I would normally send someone to a tax professional to talk about that, the cross-border issues. I don't know if Samir, that's something you can touch on.
Yeah, I generally punt that over to a CPA, but I will say that I don't think it precludes this arrangement, because I don't think there's a requirement to file as a resident in the US to maintain the H-1B visa. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think there is. I know people are doing it, so but I would defer to CPA. Yeah,
I agree. Immigration and citizenship, you're covered. Tax, it's your problem. we'll hook you up with someone.
Awesome. Okay, I know that there's 2 minutes before Samir has to jump. There's one last question here for you. I am on an H-1B visa and my wife is on an H-4 EAD. If I move to Canada with the purpose of getting back on an EB-1C, can my wife still stay in the US and continue her job as long as she has her H-4 EAD valid?
Ooh, maybe. The H-4 and the H-4 EAD is dependent for its existence on the H-1B, right? So if the H-1B doesn't exist anymore, the H-4 goes away. And the one thing that I want to avoid is that kind of happening just very kind of quietly. And before you know it, your wife is out of status for several months, right? So be very careful about that. Remember, one always goes with the other. Everything follows the H-1B. So the only way that the H-4 can stay intact is if you maintain the H-1B status. And that would require this kind of arrangement that we're talking about, where you're coming into the US frequently, working in H-1B status, right? There isn't a number of days that the government expects. There isn't like an amount of time. It's more of like, what does an officer feel like when they take a look at this record, right? So be very careful with this because it's super subjective and risky.
Awesome. Thank you, Samir.
Yeah.
For anyone who did have more questions for Samir, in particular for US immigration, we'll definitely look through your submitted questions and try to get back to you by email, just because we do only have a hard stop right now with him. Daniel, Mark, are you still able to stick around or no?
I can stay on for a few minutes, for sure.
Yeah, me as well.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Samir, thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Samir.
Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks, Samir.
Okay, so I'm gonna hammer off a few more, like 5 minutes here of some Canadian immigration questions. We did have an attendee with us today and they ask, I apply for various jobs related to software developer in Canada, but each employer asks me for a work permit. How can I find employers who are willing to sponsor from the US H-1B visa?
And that question, that is exactly why I started Path to Canada. So a few years back when I was thinking about I was doing my research to launch the company, I talked to dozens and dozens of people in the US. These are OPT expirations, people who had their H-1B, people who had left the US. And there was a comment that I kept hearing was, I keep applying to these jobs, Mark, but then they have a checkbox. If I check the box, do I have work authorization? I say no, I get this automatic reject letter. I'm like, yeah, that's how the website was set up. I understand. Then I went and talked to the Canadian companies, to their HR execs and their engineering managers. And I'm like, do you need talent? They're like, yes. And I'm like, oh, what about people from the US? They're like, oh, we wish, that'd be amazing. And I'm like, well, you've got the best work visa program in the world. And I explained it to them and they're like, oh, that's great. Well, Mark, my challenge is I, as a Canadian HR exec or as a Canadian engineering, Canadian VP who's running the engineering team, I don't know about US immigration. You just told me, I heard it wasn't good. You just told me how bad it is that people get kicked out and that there's work visas given out H-1B, but then you never get permanent residence. They're like, oh, that's new for me. I'm a Canadian. I don't understand what's happening in the US. But if someone could talk to people and find out their status that they wanted to move to the US, I absolutely would want to meet them. And that's why I launched Path to Canada. I'm like, okay, first I have to put a pool together of engineers or tech workers who want to move to Canada. My team has to talk to them and make sure, like, do you want to move to Canada? This is a one-way trip unless you boomerang 5 years back later. Here's how Canadian immigration works. We have to like share all that. And the person's like, I'm still interested, I want to go. Then I can go to the Canadian companies and be like, okay, you're signing up with Path to Canada. We have this vetted pool, but you said you'd interview them and you know that we're going to help you with immigration. And I realized I had to do some work to make both sides understand each other. So that's why I launched the service. That's why Syndesis has Path to Canada. It's a service because we realized both sides had questions and didn't know how each side worked. I'm like, I've got to put this together. So your question's exactly right. Hundreds or thousands of people who apply to Canadian jobs get frustrated. They just need a little bit of help to get to the Canadian companies who are willing to use Global Talent Stream. That's what we're doing at Path to Canada. We're talking to these companies saying, here's this amazing pool of talent. Here's what you don't know about how messed up US immigration is. Do you want to hire up these people? And the answer from the Canadians when they find out about how things work, they're like, yeah, we'll use that Global Talent Stream program. Let's do this. It's a great question.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. This one I think is more for Daniel. Ring asks, are there barriers to immigration to Canada as it concerns with the number of dependents or age of applicant?
So if a person is applying for the federal skilled worker through the express entry system on their own, they have to have a certain number of settlement funds available to support their family in Canada. It's based on your family size. It's actually it's irrespective of if your family is coming with you or not. So let's just say, for example, it's you and a family you've got a spouse and 3 children. So it's 5 of you. But your spouse and your kids are going to be staying abroad. Canada will actually still evaluate your settlement funds on the basis of a family of 5, not 1. So I think if you're coming alone, it's about $13,000, and for each additional family member, it bumps up by about $7,000. I'd have to check the scales, but that gives you a rough idea what you're looking for. And we're talking Canadian dollars. If you come on arranged employment, for example, a GTS LMIA-based work permit, and you have a permanent job offer following that work permit, you don't need to demonstrate settlement funds, whether it's you alone or you with your family members. Arranged employment counts. And it doesn't matter how much the job is paying. You could have 10 kids, right? And be up at a really high number of funds normally required for settlement funds in your bank account. Oh, but you have a full-time permanent arranged employment job in Canada on a Global Talent Stream based work permit. Okay, we don't care about you having enough money in your bank. You've got a job arranged. So that's how that would work. What was the second part of that question? I know there was a question about the entry for.
So it was around dependents and then the age of applicants. I do see a few people have asked that as well, and one close to age of 40. Is that impacting their ability to enter?
All right, the simple answer is no. The complicated answer is that you are awarded points on the basis of your age. And the older you get, the fewer points you get. you can with let's assume for a moment that you're scoring high in a language test for immigration and that you have higher levels of education, a post-secondary bachelor's degree or master's degree. All right. So if you have 3 years of work experience outside of Canada, then a person who is younger than you, between the ages of, let's say, 20 and 29 years old, they'll receive the most number of points, and they'll beat you at every time on that factor. Because when you turn 30, you start to lose points, and when you get to the age of 45, they don't award any more points for age. However, if you've come to Canada on a global talent stream based work permit, you've got at least another 50 arranged employment points. Working for Syndesis or through Path to Canada for one of the employers that Marc's company sets you up with for a period of time of 1 year, you're going to get Canadian work experience points, right? And you get Canadian work experience points for each year up to a maximum of 5 years worth of points. If you have a spouse, your spouse can get an open work permit. They can work. They can get additional points. If your spouse has higher levels of education or language ability, they can take a language test. They can have their education assessed, get more points. So I don't want to say that when you hit a certain age, oh, well, sorry, too bad, so sad, you can't apply for immigration. No. You will be allowed to make up what you might lose in age, points in the age factor, with work experience in Canada. And so it shouldn't be a barrier to immigration. Even though the numbers right now may appear to be quite high on the express entry system, this is only temporary. By, let's say, spring of next year, we're going to start getting back to the historical numbers that we saw prior to COVID. And a candidate who's a degreed professional working in Canada for a year or two, irrespective of age, should be able to apply. With the exception of someone who is like, for example, you've just retired, and you're saying, oh, now I want to apply for immigration. That's actually a special case. You actually have to come with the intention of working full time. So if you're thinking of applying through express entry, you're 7 years old, you just retired, or you're thinking about retirement, maybe that's not the best pathway for you. And reach out to my office to discuss what other options might be available. But otherwise, age is it shouldn't be a barrier.
No problem. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, I do have someone who's raised their hand, so we'll let them ask the last question before we round things up. I'm just going to hit allow to talk for Sandeep Prakash. All right. Sandeep, are you able to unmute? Or would you like to put your question into the chat?
Yeah, if he can't unmute, maybe if he types the question. While we're waiting for him, Daniel, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question on that, because the age one comes up all the time. And when people are going through express entry, like you start getting your 40s, it's counting against you, and the person's like, I'm never going to get the pick. But then if they come into global talent stream, it has no effect. Like if someone who's early mid 40s gets a tech job and Path to Canada, some tech Canadian companies like, that's amazing, 15, 18 years of experience is the dream candidate. You come right in. There's no like they're going to get their work permit. So then that person then could come in late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s. Then they're in. They're in, but then they're still they're applying for permanent residence. But then Daniel, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're going to get extra points. They're losing points for age, but then they get 50 points for the work permit when they come in, and then each year they work, they're getting more points. So they're on this continuum where they're getting more points each year they work, but then they're losing a little bit for their age. And it's an impossible question for you to answer. They're in, Canada's not going to throw them out, but then they're trying to get permanent residence.
Yeah, I should have been clear. So there is no age cap at all on the global talent stream. And I did say you start to lose points for each year that you're getting older, but the number of points that you're gaining from getting Canadian work experience far exceeds those that you're losing.
Okay.
So you will lose 5 or 10 points a year, depending on your age. You will get 50 points on arrival on that global talent stream work permit. If you're married, you will, after 1 year working in Canada, you'll gain another 35 points minimum, and you may lose 5 or 10. For an additional year, you're going to gain more points. It will, you'll continue to earn, right? Usually after that arranged employment and 1 year of Canadian work experience, We've just found 85 points. Even if you lost 5 or 10 points, it's usually enough to make up that gap if you weren't competitive before. You know, a degreed professional with a few years of work experience and good language scores, they're looking for about 75 points, 85 points maybe. But without getting people lost in the weeds, your Canadian work experience, let's say you don't have a master's degree, let's say you have a bachelor's degree. After working in Canada for a couple of years, the way that the system awards points, it will basically make up for not having a master's degree. So when I say that you gain even more points in each subsequent year, it's very true, but it really depends on each person. So you should be there after 1, if not 2 years of being in Canada on a global talent stream work permit. Also now, Marc, the global talent stream work permits are issued in 3 years. So it used to be 2 years. They've bumped that up to 3 years. We will have consultations with clients and right at the beginning say, okay, this is your age. Here are your points today. Now you have a global talent stream work permit. Let's say 3 months from now, here are your points. What does that look like after 1 year? We reduce for age, increase for Canadian experience, 2 years. And so we're very clear with clients, this is when you should receive a competitive score on express entry, barring any crazy unforeseen circumstances like, I don't know, a war in Ukraine or COVID disrupting our immigration system. But yeah, no, on all seriousness, we're very, very good with predicting those scores and laying it out to clients right at the beginning.
Thanks for sharing that, because I hear that so much. Like people say, like, I'm waiting forever in the express entry pool. I'm too old. I'm thinking, but if you got a work permit, if you came in with a job, you just pass all that, and then you're catching, like you said, you're dumping in points every year for working. It's offsetting it. It's if you're a business person and you can't qualify for global talent stream, if you're like a consultant with no tech background, if you're in a space that's not tech related, yeah, then you have a tough, then those issues do matter. But for the tech, yeah, any tech background, we identified some unique ways to come in. Allison, I know we're about 12 minutes over. Any last question or two for Daniel? I know we can probably take maybe one more, but see if you see
there's one that is from a live registrant. Paulo, he asks, is there any share of best practices of the successful Canadian experiment with the EU?
So I think if I understand Paulo's question, there's a trade agreement between Canada and the European Union. So Canada does have other pathways for persons to obtain work permits other than through obviously the Global Talent Stream LMIA. For example, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement that Canada signed with the European Union includes all 27 member nations of the EU. If you are a citizen of the EU member country and you have a job offer to work in Canada in an occupation that's covered under the agreement, and you have the requisite work or education requirements, you meet the minimum education and work requirements for the work permit, you can obtain a work permit through that agreement. And after working in Canada for 1 year, it functions for the purposes of permanent residency, just like a global talent stream-based work permit. And in fact, if Marc, you've had a number of candidates from all over the world, you'll say, you or somebody from your team will reach out to me and say, does this person qualify for a global talent stream work permit? So actually, I can get them an easier work permit through a trade agreement like the CETA, the Canada Europe Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. And then we'll start to chat with them, and they'll say, I thought I had to wait 12 weeks or 10 weeks for a work visa. I said, nope. In 2 weeks, you can be in Canada and start working. It's like amazing news, and they're pleased to hear it. So there's certainly a lot of other options for obtaining work permits for Canada other than the global talent stream. The best way to determine what those are for you in your particular situation would be to arrange a consultation. Thanks, Allison, for throwing up my contact details. And if anybody here would like to talk about their immigration, work visa options, reach out to me. If necessary, if you got a job offer, you're seeking a job offer, you're looking to relocate your employment, I'll kick them over to you, Marc. Vice versa, if someone reaches out to you, feel free to send them over to me for Canadian work visa option.
Cool, thanks, Daniel. And that's a great way to close, because in the years I've had conversations with you, there's times where I'm like, I don't think this person would qualify, but I'm just sending them over to you, and you'll send me an email back. They're like, well, wait, I had a conversation based on their situation. They do. And I'm like, reminder, always talk to a Canadian immigration professional. Like, there are so many programs we've never heard of, and you'll say, well, and you'll quote the program. And I'm like, yeah, that works. yes, everyone, if that's why I know people try and wing it. They're like, I did express entry. I'm like, that's not the only way into Canada. Always talk to a Canadian immigration professional. So thanks for sharing your background and giving an overview of the options. Super helpful. Allison, thanks for helping moderate this. And thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate it. Allison, I believe we're sending out the recording and everything will be sent out to the attendees.
Yeah, I just sent it in the chat, and just again, thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate you sticking around a little bit longer. To Mark's point, we will be sending out the recording with closed captioning as requested within the next 24 hours. If you have any other questions that came up perhaps after, feel free to email us at connect@syndesis.com. I'll throw that in the chat. But thank you guys, and thank you, Daniel and Mark, and obviously Samir, who's not here right now, for a really awesome webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Sure.